Which way out? The man in the doorway asked it in the tone of someone who has been holding a question long enough that it has become the only sentence left. Luis Vega had been locking up the Veterans Connection Resource Center on Flores Street in San Antonio. Last person from the Tuesday group had gone 20 minutes ago. The lights were down to the hall circuit. The bad coffee maker was off when he appeared. An army man by his jacket, 30s, standing in the half-closed doorframe with an expression Luis recognized. He had seen it once in a mirror and had not forgotten it. He was about to say the center was closed. Come back in the morning, which was what you said at 9 on a Tuesday when the lights were off and the last group had gone. When Coda made the sound, not the alarm bark, not the aggressor note, the low sustained whine she used in exactly one context. The sound that meant, I need you to pay attention to this person right now. Luis put his hand on the door and did not close it. What happened in the 4 hours that followed? In a room with 2 folding chairs and a bad coffee maker, and a dog who understood certain things before the people around her did, was not extraordinary in the way that word is usually meant. It was the night someone asked. It was the night someone stopped walking. If you haven't found this channel yet, subscribe. This is the kind of story we tell here. Luis Vega was 31 and had been a Marine for 7 years before a knee injury ended the option of being one anymore, and had spent the 2 years since working out who he was when he wasn't that. He had grown up in San Antonio, the youngest of 4, in a house where his father had served and his grandfather had served, and the conversation about service had been as ordinary as dinner, which meant the conversation about what service cost had also been ordinary, not dramatic, not hidden, just present. The way weather is present in a place that has weather. He had 2 tours with the 1st Marine Division. He had come home from the second, one different in the specific way that the second tour makes people different from the first, and had spent the better part of a year figuring out that different wasn't the same as broken, and had found the resource center through a friend's referral, and had found the Tuesday group, and had found, slowly, that the talking helped in both directions. He had been running the group for 14 months. He was there every Tuesday at 6 and stayed until everyone had left and the lights were down and the door was locked, because a room where people are willing to say difficult things has to be held closed carefully on both sides. And Luis understood this, and he took the closing seriously. Coda was 5 years old, a Belgian Malinois, the tawny brown of dried grass, with the amber alertness of her breed, and a specific cross-training that most people who met her didn't know about. She had been trained in cortisol and stress response detection, a program that had come out of the veteran therapy dog research, which meant she could identify acute distress in humans before the humans were always aware of it themselves or before the people around them had registered what they were seeing. Her alert was not a bark. It was the low, sustained whine, different from her working sounds, different from her comfort sounds, specific to one thing. She had used it 4 times in 14 months of Tuesday nights. Luis had learned, after the first 2 times, to stop what he was doing and look. Derek Cole had been 34 for 3 months and had been a staff sergeant in the 3rd Infantry Division for 9 years before the IED on a road outside Kandahar in 2021 had changed the arithmetic of his future. The blast had given him a traumatic brain injury, which the Army had documented, and had given him other things. The sleep architecture that no longer worked the way sleep was supposed to work, the specific internal weather that arrived without announcement and made the ordinary dimensions of a day feel unmanageable, which the Army had also documented in its way, and he had been medically discharged 8 months after the strike with paperwork that described accurately what was wrong with his body, and less accurately, what was wrong with everything else. His wife had left in February. Her name was Dana, and she had tried for 18 months after his discharge, and had told him, at the end, that she was not leaving him but was leaving the version of their life that was hurting their son to watch. And Derek had not argued because she was right, and not arguing because someone is right is one of the loneliest things there is. His son Marcus was 4 years old and lived in Austin now with Dana and her mother, and Derek called on Sundays when he could make himself do it, which was not always. When he did call, Marcus talked about trains and a kid at daycare named Eli who was either his best friend or his nemesis depending on the week. And Derek listened and laughed in the right places and hung up feeling further away than he had before the call, which was something he had stopped telling anyone because no one knew what to do with it. He had been through 3 jobs since the discharge. He had been in and out of a VA outpatient program that he found useful in the specific way of something that might be more useful if he went more consistently, which he did not. He had a prescription he filled when he could make himself drive to the pharmacy. He had stopped running, which he used to do every morning, because the mornings had become a specific kind of difficult that made getting out of bed feel like a project that required more planning than he had available. He had been in San Antonio for 2 weeks, in the apartment of a friend from his unit who was deployed and had given Derek the key and told him to stay as long as he needed. He had needed 2 weeks. He was not sure what he needed after 2 weeks. He had driven past the building on Flores Street 6 times in 3 days, and had stopped tonight without entirely understanding why stopping had finally been possible. His father had served in the Gulf War in 1991. His father had come home and been, mostly, fine, had worked, had been present, had been the father you could point to and say, he was there. For 7 years, then he had not been fine, and then he had not been there, and Derek had been 11 when that happened. He had been carrying the specific arithmetic of those 7 years since he was 11 years old. He was in year 2 of his own accounting, and the years were what he thought about when he could not sleep, which was often. Is there someone in your life who has gone quiet, not dramatically, not with a crisis you could point to, just quieter than they used to be? If so, tonight might be the night to call. Type their name in the comments if you want. I read every one. Lewis said, out of what? He had not stepped back. He had not stepped forward. He was holding the door, which meant the door was still open, and he was looking at Derek with the full attention that meant he had heard the real question under the surface question and was not going to pretend he hadn't. Derek said, I drove past this place a few times. I know, Lewis said, which was not literally true. He hadn't known, but was the right thing to say because it meant you don't have to explain the driving past. I understand the driving past. Coda was at the door now. She was not in front of Derek or behind Luis. She was beside Derek, and the wine had stopped, and she was simply there. Luis said, come in for a minute. Coffee's cold, but it's there. He came in. They sat in the group room on the folding chairs, the same chairs that sat in a circle on Tuesday nights, now just 2 of them facing each other at an angle that wasn't quite confrontational and wasn't quite side by side. The kind of arrangement you arrive at when no one has decided yet what this conversation is. Lewis poured 2 cups of coffee that had been sitting in the pot for 2 hours and was exactly as bad as he had described it, and set one in front of Derek without asking. Coda settled onto the floor between them and put her head on Derek's knee. She did not ask permission. She assessed the situation and made a decision, which was what she always did. Derek looked at the coffee. He did not drink it for 20 minutes. They talked the way people talk when one of them is deciding how far the talking can go, circling, surface level, the resume of someone's life rather than the inside of it. Derek mentioned Afghanistan. Luis mentioned his own tours. Derek mentioned the TBI. Luis nodded without performing sympathy, because performing sympathy is the thing that stops people from continuing, and Derek was the kind of man who would stop if he sensed he was being handled. Luis had learned this in 14 months of Tuesday nights. The people with the most to say are the most sensitive to the moment when you start managing them instead of listening. He noticed the jacket. Derek had been wearing it for days by the look of the collar. He noticed the way Derek's eyes moved to the room's exits when the building settled in the October night. The automatic vigilance that didn't go away just because you weren't in the field anymore. He noticed that Derek's hands were still, not the relaxed stillness of someone at rest, but the controlled stillness of someone managing what their hands would be doing otherwise. He said nothing about any of these things. He asked Derek where he was from. Turns out, Beaumont, Texas, about 2 hours east. Derek's grandmother still lived there. She was 91 and had made the same sweet potato pie for 50 years and still answered her own phone on the second ring, which Derek mentioned with a small specific warmth that was the first color Luis had seen in his face. Luis said his own grandmother was from Corpus Christi and had held strong opinions about every decision Luis had ever made, and Derek's mouth moved at one corner, which was something. Around 9:30, Derek drank the coffee. Lewis did not mark this. He continued what he was saying, but he filed it the way you file the small signals that tell you which direction someone is facing. Coda's tail moved once. Just once. Around 10 o'clock, Derek took a photograph out of his jacket pocket and set it on the folding table between them. An old photograph, A man in uniform, the kind of uniform that belonged to a different era. The man in the photograph had Derek's face arranged differently, younger, the specific quality of a face before it has been certain places. Derek said, "My grandfather, Korea, 7th Infantry Division." Luis looked at the photograph. He said, "My great-uncle, same division, different regiment." Luis said, "I know the patch." Not relief, something more complicated. The expression of a man who has just discovered that a connection he thought was private is actually shared, which is both a comfort and an exposure. He said, "My grandfather came back from Korea and just lived, never talked about it, worked his whole life, had 9 grandkids, died in 2018 at 87 in his own bed." He said it the way someone describes a miracle they don't believe they'll inherit. "My dad did one tour in the Gulf," Derek said. "Came home, was fine." For 7 years, Luis did not speak. He waited. Derek looked at the photograph. "I'm in year 2, he said. The room was very quiet for a moment. The fluorescent light above them had a slight flicker that neither of them mentioned. Luis said, "How long have you been carrying it?" Derek said, "My dad got to 7 years." The room was still. Coda, whose head had been on Derek's knee for an hour, pressed slightly closer. Not dramatically, just a slight increase in contact, the specific additional weight of a dog that has detected something and is responding to it. Luis had heard a great many things in 14 months of Tuesday nights. He had heard things that required him to call people who could help, and things that required him to sit very still and let the weight of them settle, and things that required him to say something very simple at exactly the right moment. He had learned to tell the difference. He said, "Your son's name is Marcus." Derek looked at him. "You said it earlier, when you were talking about calling on Sundays." He looked at the photograph on the table, his grandfather's face, the unit patch, the specific dignity of a man who had served and come home and lived 87 years. He said, "Marcus is 4. "I know," Louis said. The word "know" in that context meant something specific. It meant, "I heard it, and I held it, and I am telling you that I held it." Derek's phone buzzed on the table. He reached over and turned it face down. Luis looked at the phone. He had seen this motion before, the specific way people turn a phone over that is different from turning a phone over because you are busy. The way you turn it when you have been not answering it, and you do not want to be reminded of the not answering. He said, "Is there someone who wants to know where you are tonight?" Derek said, "My dad never called anyone." He looked at the photograph of Derek's grandfather on the table, the man who had served and come home and lived 87 years. He looked at Derek. He said, "You're not your dad." The statement was not an argument. It was not a reassurance. It was not the opening of a larger speech about the future and the reasons to stay. It was a fact, stated in the simple, flat register of someone who means it without decoration, and who understands that the most important things sometimes need to be said as plainly as possible so that they arrive without interference. Derek looked at the phone on the table with its face to the wood. Coda had not moved. Her weight was still against Derek's boot. The fluorescent light above them continued its slight flicker. Luis said, "I'll stay here as long as you need to stay here." He meant it. He had nowhere to be. He had been here before in other forms, had sat in this room at different hours with different people, and he had learned that staying was sometimes the most technical skill available and was worth practicing. Derek looked at the photograph. He looked at Coda. He looked at the coffee, the second cup, which he had drunk, which meant something in the specific language of small signals that Luis had been tracking for 2 hours. He picked up the phone. He called his brother in Houston, his brother whose name was James and who had been calling Derek's phone for 3 weeks and leaving messages that Derek had been listening to and not answering, answered on the first ring at 11:30 at night with the specific speed of someone who has been waiting for exactly this call and is not going to make the caller feel the weight of the waiting. They talked for 40 minutes. Louis sat in his chair and read nothing and did nothing and let the room hold what it was holding. Coda had moved from Derek's knee to the floor beside the chair, her weight against Derek's boot. At the end of the call, Derek told his brother where he was. James said he was driving from Houston and would be there by 3 in the morning, and Derek should not go anywhere. Derek said he wasn't going anywhere. He said it in a voice that had some color back in it. Not much, not dramatically, but the specific small color of a person who has put one foot down on solid ground after a long time without footing. James arrived at 3:15. Luis had made fresh coffee, which was marginally less bad than the first pot, and Derek had drunk 2 cups of it, and they had talked for 3 more hours about things that needed saying and had not been said for a long time. Some of it was about Afghanistan. Some of it was about Marcus. Some of it was about Derek's father, not the ending, but the beginning, what his father had been before the 7 years, the man his grandfather had raised, the parts of the story that tended to get lost. James sat with Derek in the parking lot for a long time. Luis watched through the window for a while and then gave them the space, because some things require the people who belong to them. In the morning, Derek agreed to go to the inpatient program he had been avoiding for 6 months. He said he wanted to call Marcus on Sunday. His brother said he would make sure it happened. Luis locked the resource center at 4 in the morning, which was 6 hours later than usual. He drove home in the October dark with Coda in the passenger seat and the Spanish oak trees of San Antonio moving in the early morning air, and he thought about the photograph of Derek's grandfather, the man who had come back from Korea and worked his whole life and died at 87 in his own bed. And he thought about what it meant to inherit something and what it meant to interrupt the inheritance. He thought about his own father, who had served and come home and raised 4 children, and was now 63 and lived 2 miles from Luis's apartment and called on Sundays without fail. He thought, I should call more than Sundays. He called that afternoon. The following Tuesday, there was a new person at the group. He sat in the circle and didn't talk, which was fine. The group had learned long ago that not talking was also a form of being there, and being there was all the first visit required. He had a cup of the bad coffee. He came back the week after. What Luis Vega did on a Tuesday night in San Antonio was not complicated in the way these things sometimes get made to sound. He was about to close a door and a dog told him not to, and he listened to the dog, and he stayed. He had the same hour as every other person on Flores Street that night. He put his hand on the door and did not close it, and the rest followed from that. He picked up the phone. That was the whole of it. Everything else was what came before the 5 words and what came after. This story is for every veteran carrying something alone, counting years, not answering the phone, driving past buildings, and not stopping. And for everyone who has been the person at the door, you don't have to know what to say, you just have to keep the door open. If this story touched something in you, or if you know someone it describes, the Veterans Crisis Line is available 24 hours a day. Call or text 988 and press 1. You can also text 838-255. You can also chat at veteranscrisisline.net. If you'd rather talk to someone who has been there, the peer support line is 1-800-273-8255. There are more people like Luis. There are more people like Derek. Every one of them deserves to have someone stop. Every story on this channel is about choosing not to look away. If that means something to you, subscribe so you're here for the next one. Which moment in this story stayed with you? I'll see you in the comments.